I'm really excited to present the first half of my interview with my guest, April Farham. April is doing some really interesting things about telling the stories of the early California settlers, especially women on the California frontier, and in particular, some women whose ancestry was both indigenous and Spanish, and how that played out in their lives and the lives of their descendants. In fact, April's work dovetails really well and is connected to the work that Jennifer Lucido has been doing. If you recall, I spoke to Jennifer in episode 45 of the podcast, and toward the end of July of 2024. Basically, this really interesting project of unearthing these genealogical stories, connecting the family trees, connecting the different kin groups, and then building out the stories of these people, in particular, like I said, in particular, women of mixed ancestry and how their lives and the lives of their descendants played out in Alta California. So, like I mentioned, this first part, we're going to talk about April's background, how she got into her research, and the things that are getting her excited about digging into California history. And then the next episode will be the second half of my interview with her. Full disclosure, April has given me the honor of helping her with translations and transcriptions of some of these old Spanish documents that there are still tons of them in the archives in California that need to be revealed. So I'm happy to be able to cooperate with her in her research. So without further ado, part one of my interview with April Farnham. April, thanks so much for taking the time to come on this podcast and tell us about the really interesting research that you're doing. As you know, we know each other, and I've been to a number of your talks, especially about how indigenous, Mestiza, African descendant as well, the California frontier, created lives, families, etc., all throughout the late 18th century and 19th century. And so I'd love if you could talk to us a little bit more about that and the cool things you're doing. And, maybe start a little bit by talking about who you are and yourself and your interests and all that and how you got into this topic.
Sure. Thank you, Damien. It's actually quite a pleasure to be on your show. So I've been listening to you for a long time. So I primarily grew up in Sacramento, and spent a lot of summers going to different state parks, visiting museums, missions. I got my undergraduate degrees at Sacramento State, CSU Sacramento. Originally, it was actually in environmental science. That was my first career. Didn't go back until about 10 years later, and I decided to get a bachelor's degree in history, but with a focus in anthropology and Native American studies. And then, from there, with that background and knowledge, spent a little time working for the Maidu Indian Museum in Roseville. I also did some contract work, consulting work for the California Indian Heritage Center and the West Sacramento Historical Society. And then in 2014, our family, we moved to Napa Valley. I was still raising my son at the time, but finally decided to go back to school and get my graduate degree, my master's degree in history from Sonoma State University. And again, with an emphasis on what I call California ethnohistory, really focusing on interactions and between indigenous peoples and immigrants in different colonial periods, Spanish, Mexican, and American, Um, uh, and so one thing kind of led to another, and I got involved in a couple projects associated with the Sonoma State Historic Park and their nonprofit group, which is Sonoma Petaluma Parks. And so I mean, my background, because of the experience I had working, I would say specifically at the State Indian Museum, and also working with their basket collections in their warehouse, it really got me interested in just particularly stories about different indigenous women basket makers and their histories here in California. Again, my work, particularly there was a book that I worked on with Brian Bibby called Essential Art. And it was essentially a catalog book of the basket collection at the California Indian Heritage Center, their main warehouse. My contribution was writing a history of the State Indian Museum. But again, just kind of getting to know some of those, working with some of the baskets, I got to know some of the individual stories of the women. So I've just continued that work. Everything I do now, my research, my writing, presentations I do on the side also informs the interpretation that I do as an employee with California State Parks at Sonoma State Historic Park.
That's right. So you are still employed with the state parks over at Sonoma, and it's interesting to see how you started out there in Sacramento, which I think a lot of people don't know or haven't visited the State Indian Museum. It's an interesting place, and I didn't know about the collections they have. Can you tell us, just before we get into your more recent stuff, a little bit about those collections?
Yeah. So at the time when this was about 10, 12 years ago, when I was working directly with the material there, they have, I believe, over 5,000, baskets and other ethnographic objects connected to, California Indian peoples. The collection was amassed over time. I think since the 1930s, when I recollect from my research, started with a curator there named Benjamin Hathaway, who at the time was visiting different tribal rancherias, collecting baskets, and over time that institution, that institution really grew, and so these baskets have been donated from various, different individuals, they're loaned out often to different small museums or larger museums. So when I was working at the Maidu Indian Museum, we were able to loan a few of their baskets to do a display and kind of an interpretive exhibit on Maidu basketry specifically. But the baskets represent a wide range of cultural and ethnographic groups throughout California. It's really an amazing collection, and I feel very fortunate that I had the opportunity to work with those baskets.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Maidu Indian Museum? Because I don't think a lot of people know about that place either, unless you live in the Sacramento area.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So it started out as a kind of more of an interpretive center, small museum. It's now a fully accredited museum run by the city of Roseville. It's not too far of a drive from downtown Sacramento. I'd say maybe 20, 30 minutes. My role there, between about 2009 to 2013, give or take, I was the collections manager. I also did some interpretation there for some of the school programs, school outreach programs. And I think, at the time, their hours, they had a few, they were open during the week a little more often. I think the hours have been reduced to just weekend hours now, Saturdays, Sundays. I don't remember the particulars, but you can actually Google Maidu Indian Museum. And I'm proud to say that I worked on some of those permanent exhibits. The design of the museum was loosely based on a Maidu roundhouse, and it has 2 stories: an upper gallery that features contemporary native artwork, and then the downstairs have all the permanent exhibits that talk about the different time periods that the Maidu experienced in terms of their the colonization of California and whatnot. So it's really a gem, I would say, and highly recommend. I think they still offer, guided hikes. There's a couple acres there that's actually part of a National Historic Landmark site. The village, as I remember, dates back close to 7,000 years old in terms of habitation, people that were there, living there. They have petroglyphs that you can see, rock art. So it's really an amazing site.
I've been there a number of times. I didn't know that you worked on those exhibits. They're really nice. So that's good to know. The next time I go there, I'll remember that. And it's a nice place. And I agree. In addition to the museum, the area outside where you can see the petroglyphs is really interesting and unusual. And like you say, it's a gem. There's not a lot of places like that where you can experience that kind of history, especially if it goes back to at least 7,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So you are over in Sonoma now, and you continued your research. And like I said, I've had the chance to hear some of your talks, and I'd like if you can tell us a little bit more about the type of things that you moved into in terms of being over on that side of, the region.
Yeah, I'll have to say, I'm kind of ashamed to say, when I first moved here, when growing up in Sacramento, even in college, we're so inundated with really a focus on gold rush history and there, I did specifically focus on Native history in my college studies, so I did have some understanding of California early history and anthropology, but because the focus is so much on John Sutter, right, and the gold rush, didn't know a whole lot about for example, General Vallejo, Mariano Vallejo, or the Rancho period. Hadn't really studied many of the Californios of that time period. Had a little bit exposure to the history of the missions, but not like an in-depth, I wouldn't say any kind of in-depth, reading of, primary source material on the missions, either from, padres or later immigrants that were coming in and making observations about what they saw. Until I moved here to Napa, and I started going to graduate school at Sonoma State, and there realized that here, I mean, it's the focus shifts entirely, or quite dramatically, I would say, to an emphasis on the Mexican period of California, and just the fact that there are so many sites in Sonoma County, such as Petaluma Adobe State Park, General Vallejo's Rancho, Mission San Francisco Solano, and other Adobe sites or historic sites connected to the Mexican period. That became a new focus of research for me, and then I started to kind of connect the dots, so to speak, with things I had read previously, associated with these basket collections, right, that I had been studying in Sacramento, and realizing that, some of these basket collections were coming from, right, or had been handed down from these rancho owners, either the dons, the soldiers, or their wives. And so then I became really fascinated with stories of the doña, women, wives of the soldiers who own ranchos out here. Not just, Benicia Vejo, Ariano's wife, but, for example, Maria Carrillo, who is, considered the founder of Santa Rosa because she was granted a very large land grant out there. And then also became very interested here in Napa. We have what we call the old adobe, right? It's the Juarez adobe. And that was one of the homes of Cayetano Juarez, who was a soldier of Mr. Vallejo, served under him, both at the Presidio in San Francisco and in the barracks at Sonoma. And and through those different research I was doing for my grad school work, I realized, right, there was definitely a theme here with specifically with the women, the wives, and how they came to end up being, married to these fairly powerful men, prominent men here in, Sonoma and Napa, and what it meant to them, right? Culturally, socially, economically, how it impacted the native peoples that were still living in the area, right? At the time that like Mission San Francisco Solano was established, up through secularization. So yeah, that's how I really, I think it wasn't until about 2017, 2018 that I literally started going down the rabbit hole, so to speak, with the looking at the early California Population Project database, a wonderful resource of all the mission, baptism, marriage, and death records, and just finding like incredible stories being told just through those records alone, right? Just through those records that, thankfully were digitized and automated. And I know that was an incredible amount of work that was put into that, but it's incredibly valuable to researchers such as myself, because we can often we don't have the time or the means to, right, visit the archives in person and look at those actual documents in person.
And so just to be able to do a search under a name or a date or a particular mission or what have you is just invaluable. That database is an incredible resource. I can't imagine what it must have been like. Well, I can't imagine a little bit what it must have been like to work with those records before that database existed. You had to go to the different archives and sort of, try and pluck a needle out of a haystack. It's an amazing database. Right.
It really is. So, I mean, and it helped me get through graduate school because, again, my son was still in high school, and I didn't have the time or means to visit a lot of the archives. I did visit a few. I went down to the California Historical Society archives in San Francisco to look at primary source material there. I spent a little time in the archives at the Sonoma Barracks. This is prior to my acquiring a position there with state parks. But for the most part, right, it's these digitized records and that database that really saw me through my master's work. And ironically, so my master's thesis is actually more on Hawaiian immigrants, Kanaka Maoli immigrants who came here just before the gold rush as part of the hide and tallow industry, and then through the gold rush. And it had a direct connection to my work at the Maidu Indian Museum because some of them settled down along the Sacramento River and had families with some of the indigenous Maidu women who were, again, living and surviving through a fairly chaotic, tumultuous time, and just trying to, preserve their culture and survive economically. And that's where these Hawaiian immigrants really come into that story.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm not familiar with that. I mean, I knew that there were Hawaiian Kanakas, as they call them, right, on those ships coming, those trading ships coming down the coast, but I didn't know about them settling in the Sacramento Valley. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a little known story. It ties into, I won't go into the politics, but there are some rancherias in and around Sacramento and up in Placerville, Auburn, that area. That, the peoples have both Hawaiian and indigenous descent, and are very proud of that heritage and still, culturally, they practice both, sides, in terms of the California indigenous culture and, some the traditions of the Hawaiian culture and like the dances and songs and so, but it really kind of opened my eyes to some of the other literature and the sources that were out there, particularly for places like Petaluma Adobe Park, Fort Ross, just locally, how, the sources I was using to tell that story could be used to maybe flesh out the nuances of some of the more, local stories, such as like the Juarez adobe, right, and that family, and their connections, right, to the indigenous peoples here in southern Napa Valley, as well as in Sonoma as well. Some of the other rancho owners and like Maria Creo and how they had connections as well.
It's funny, growing up in the Napa Valley, I remember the old Adobe restaurant, right? And I had no idea that it was a historical site and it was connected to this long-standing family there, the Juarez family in Napa. I just, I was a teenager, so I wasn't paying much attention. But isn't that one of the oldest Adobe buildings in Northern California?
It is, yeah. So I think it dates around 1839 or so. The Rancho land grant that Cayetano Juarez received, it wasn't official until 1840, it's my understanding. Very large, 8,000 acre plus grant called Rancho Tulakai. And that word itself, right, the name comes from one of these Patwin, southern Wintun villages that existed in the area. So that home, it's still there. Like you said, it's a very historic landmark here in Napa, right off of Soft School Road. And it's seen different restaurants come and go. The latest one is Lativ Bakery. They're doing very well. And it was fully restored, when they, before they moved in, this last tenant, there was a buyer who just went in and completely restored the adobe, to structure it and make it a little more integrous, I guess, and hold up better over time. But I know they found some extraordinary artifacts in reflooring the building, and some of the other when they had to do some repairs to the walls. They made a lot of different discoveries, and a lot of that material, that information went to both the Napa Valley Museum and the Napa County Historical Society.
Oh, that's great. So wonderful. So, yeah, tell us a little bit more then about the work you've been doing with these women, Maria Juarez and her descendants and ancestors, and what you're learning and discovering.
Sure. So, I said, I think this story goes all the way back to, again, when I was managing those, or kind of working with those baskets at the California State Heritage Center. There was a great granddaughter of the Juarez family that donated a few baskets that both Maria and Cayetano had collected in their time here on Rancho Tulakai. And these were mostly Patwin baskets, maybe some Wapo. And that story just always intrigued me because, Brian wrote in his book, Essential Art, that Maria specifically, he had started this kind of genealogical research himself, was 1/4 Ohlone through her mother and grandmother. And so I was very intrigued by that. And when I moved here, when I was working for a time for the Napa Valley Museum as an educator, I hooked up with Ralph Shanks, another well-known native basket scholar. And I discovered in my research, I'm always researching this. It's in my blood. I can't help it. I always like to find new stories. Was doing research for the Napa Valley Museum at the Napa County Historical Society. And I came across the memoirs of, it was one of the great granddaughters of the Cayetano Juarez. She was the sister of this woman, Dolores Unger, who had donated the baskets to the California state parks. This sister, her name was Vivian Rose Juarez. She wrote a family book called Past as a Father of Present, I believe, and she this is the 1970s, and she featured in this book a sewing basket that belonged to Maria Juarez, right? And it told this specific story about this Patwin Native woman who had given, and her name was Juanita. That's all we know. That's what's in the book. Had given this sewing basket to Maria Juarez as a present, literally a gift, for some of the work that Maria had been doing within the Native community. Maria, according to this book, she was a curandera, a healer, right? She had learned from her mother and her grandmother some of the traditional ethnobotanical ways of treating illnesses. My guess is, it doesn't actually say in this book, but there was a smallpox epidemic that hit the Native community here pretty hard in around 1837, 1838. And I think Maria was involved in helping treat some of the women and children in Napa Valley. She also understood the language. She taught herself how, even though she couldn't read or write, Maria was multilingual. So most definitely spoke Spanish, but also it's documented that she knew the local Patwin language. The people call themselves, the village, I understand, is called Tulakai, but the people call themselves Ulikai or Ulika. And that was the language that Maria learned, and she taught her children as well, this language. And so, they had, this family seemed to have a very close relationship with the local Native indigenous community here in Napa. I apologize if I forget where I was going with all this, but just that I kept peeling away layers of the story. One thing that always bothered me was, some of the local sources here were saying that Maria, and still to this day, so they're kind of overcoming this stereotype somewhat, was that Maria was, full-blood Spanish Mexican, did not have any kind of Mestiza heritage whatsoever, that she was part of this, colonial period where Mexican dons and doñas were, coming in and claiming land and, taking advantage of local Native communities. But again, my research was confirming with what Brian had already started, and that was the mission records prove, right, that she is a direct descendant of these indigenous women in Monterey that were marrying or being married to Spanish and Mestizo soldiers, right, in the early part of the mission period, particularly at Mission Carmel. And that heritage, that knowledge, it had been passed down from her. So her grandmother was Viridiana Maria, right? And then she had a mother, Maria Higuera, and then her herself, right, Maria Juarez, but her nickname was Viviana after her grandmother, for a good reason, right? Because in my opinion, it was, the mothers, the maternal line, they were very proud of the fact that, they descended from this Ohlone woman who had married a soldier, like I think she was age 12 or 13 when she married in 1786. So like I said, I kept, this took some time for me. This didn't happen all overnight. It started when we first moved here to Napa, and then I kept reading a little bit more from different sources, and putting these different stories together to get a fuller picture of what was happening here with the Juarez family. And up until right now, even I'm still, with your help, translating material, Spanish script, letters from the archives, to understand maybe how Cayetano was influenced and helped by his wife's knowledge, right, of this indigenous world, and how it affected his relationship with like the Vallejo family and his activities as a soldier.
What you say makes me think of two things. First of all, how the type of work of digging around in the archives and going back into the original language documents really helps both history, right? It helps clarify historical events and people and situations, but it also helps clarify genealogy as well, right? So you can find that that interface of genealogy and history, which I really find fascinating, because you see how family connections are so important, and yet they're often really below the surface. They're not evident to the world, and sometimes exactly because of the situation we find ourselves in with the way California was annexed pretty quickly in a couple of years, and then things change very fast, that people have to do a lot of work to recover their history. And then secondly, the thing you mentioned about how this has been a work of years, that sometimes you can't just go and do research and find your answers. Sometimes it's over time letting something percolate and certain connections emerge between one thing you've seen here and one thing you've seen over there, and then the picture starts to take shape, maybe in a way that you didn't expect when you started out. Do you find that to be true yourself?
Absolutely. And that's what I really enjoy about calling myself an ethnohistorian is, we're trained to, and I've had some very great professors train me very well in this. And, looking at different sources, from anthropological literature, archaeology, I mentioned the museum collections, the baskets, oral histories, letters, diaries, of course, the paper trail left by different written sources, and it's the whole of that, right? Looking at it from all these different perspectives and angles that is what motivates me to dig deeper, right? And I keep, like I said, I keep finding these new details by looking at it from different perspectives. So now I'm really focused on the archival research, particularly at the Santa Barbara Mission Archives there, and wishing I had a little more training in Spanish, translation and early Spanish script, but it's just, takes time.
This is the California Frontier Show. If you would like to know more about the California Frontier Project, visit californiafrontier.net. If you would like to support the show, scroll down in the show notes and click Support the Show. Then be sure to tell all your friends about the podcast. If you would like to connect with me, the host, send me an email at damien@californiafrontier.net.